This is ground zero for a crisis that's gripping cities across America and beyond. I'm here in San Francisco, California, where the owner of this $500 million building recently defaulted on its mortgage. This type of thing's happening with increasing frequency, not just in San Francisco, but in many other cities as well. And it could have dire consequences for landlords, for banks, for local governments, and potentially even the economy at large. Here's everything you need to know about the commercial real estate crisis. So as you can probably tell, the buildings around me are office buildings, but you'll notice that there's not a whole lot of people here. This part of San Francisco is known as the financial district, and up until a few years ago, it was usually pretty busy around here at this time of the day. But in 2020, something happened that changed everything. The pandemic. Now, the pandemic's impact on the economy and on our lives has diminished over the past couple of years. Most people hardly even think about it anymore. But there's one area where the pandemic has permanently altered the way many of us live our lives. Starting in 2020, millions of office workers began working remotely, leaving giant office buildings like these empty. At the height of the pandemic, nearly 60% of work was done at home. Some workers, like those in the tech industry, worked completely remotely. Then once the pandemic ended, people started to slowly go back to offices, but things are nowhere near what they were before. And it's unlikely we'll ever go back to the way things were before the pandemic. Today, around 12% of full-time employees work from home exclusively, and another 29% have hybrid work arrangements where they work some of the time on-site and the rest of the time at home. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether a fully remote, a hybrid, or a fully on-site work arrangement is the best. There's probably no right answer. It depends on the job, on the person, and on the company in question. But regardless, we're in a new world where working from home is going to be much more prevalent, especially for white-collar office jobs. And that means that office buildings are going to be utilized much less than they were before. If you look at the latest office attendance data, currently the average office is only at 50% capacity on any given day. That's a lot of unused office space. Too much office space. That's why companies have been moving quickly to reduce the amount of office space that they lease, either by subleasing to other tenants or letting their leases expire when they come up for renewal. Some are even taking a more aggressive approach. Twitter, which leases space in this building, hasn't been paying its rent this year. And word is it's trying to renegotiate its lease with its landlord to save some money. So it's pretty clear that demand for office space is declining significantly. But owners of office buildings like real estate investment trusts, private equity firms, and others aren't the only ones who will be impacted by this. Fewer tenants means less revenue from rents, which makes it more difficult for landlords to pay back the loans that are backing these buildings. You see, just as individuals and families use mortgages to purchase their homes, most commercial real estate is financed using loans as well. Either bank loans or things like commercial mortgage-backed securities where money is raised from investors. So less revenue means less money to pay back loans, and that's naturally going to cause a larger number of building owners to be delinquent on their loan payments or to outright default. That in turn is going to hurt lenders like banks and investors in commercial mortgage-backed securities. Another group that's going to be hurt by this is local governments. In cities across America, property taxes make up a big chunk of local government's revenues. In New York City, taxes on office buildings make up 10% of the city's total tax revenues. Meanwhile, the businesses around office buildings, like restaurants, convenience stores, and other shops, will also feel the effects of the decline in office attendance. Less foot traffic around office buildings will result in the loss of billions of dollars of potential sales. Public transportation systems may also be strained as well. Fewer days in the office means less time commuting on trains and buses. In fact, the top 8 transportation agencies in the U.S. are already facing steep budget shortfalls because of reduced ridership. As a result, they're thinking of cutting services and reducing operating hours, which are things that'll make them even less attractive to riders. This cycle, where fewer people in offices, leads to less spending and less tax revenues, which then leads to cuts in public and private services, which ultimately leads to people spending less time in cities, is what some people are calling an urban doom loop. It's the reason why mayors of New York City and San Francisco have called for workers to return to offices. In some cases, they've even pushed employers to force their workers to come back in. But their pleas have largely fallen on deaf ears. Remote working is here to stay, and cities have to adapt to this new reality. The bad news for all the parties impacted by this is things aren't going to get better anytime soon. In fact, they're probably going to get worse. The fact of the matter is, we haven't felt the full impact of the work from home phenomenon on commercial real estate yet. The average office lease in the US is 7 years. So even though companies want to reduce their office footprints, they haven't been able to yet because they're locked into leases. Remember how I said the average office is only half full today? Well, the vacancy rate, or the percentage of office space that doesn't have a lease, is 20%. That's a record high vacancy rate, but based on office attendance, it seems like that rate could go even higher in the future. As leases come up for renewal, more and more companies are going to let them expire, leading to more vacancies. Now, unfortunately for building owners, their problems don't end there. The plunge in demand for offices due to more people working from home is already a massive headache for them. But this couldn't have come at a worse time. Over the past year and a half, interest rates have gone through the roof due to elevated levels of inflation. Higher interest rates increase borrowing costs for building owners, and they reduce property values as well. So this is a terrible combination for landlords. Their borrowing costs are going to go up at the same time that their rents and property values are going to go down. The full effects of this will be felt when it comes time for building owners to pay back their loans. Many will be unable to pay them back. And whereas in the past they might have been able to refinance their loans to give them more time, high interest rates could eliminate that possibility. Analysts at MSCI estimate that $155 billion worth of U.S. commercial real estate could face financial troubles in the next few years. Now, when a building owner defaults on its loans, that kicks off a foreclosure process where the lender will try to recoup their money by selling the property. Banks finance 40 to 60% of U.S. commercial real estate, so they're the ones who are going to be left holding the bag when landlords can't make their payments. In many cases, they'll end up selling these properties at extremely depressed prices. One report from researchers at NYU and Columbia Business School suggests that office property values might decline by 44% from their peak levels by the end of this decade. Another report from analysts at Capital Economics says that prices could fall by 35% by 2025. That would be a big hit for any banks holding onto these properties. And because banks are so fundamental to our financial system, their troubles could spread to the rest of the economy if they dramatically pull back on lending. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are rosier projections that paint a much more optimistic picture for office buildings. The commercial real estate services firm Cushman & Wakeman predicts that there will still be plenty of demand for office space in the future as companies adapt to a hybrid work environment. They believe that there's going to be 330 million square feet of excess office space by the end of the decade. But that's not a huge amount when you compare it to the 5.68 billion square feet of total office inventory that they expect there to be at that time. Analysts at the firm believe that high-end, modern office buildings with a lot of amenities will have no problem attracting tenants, while older, generic buildings with few amenities will have the most trouble attracting tenants. Longer term, a solution for those older buildings is for them to be converted, either into other types of commercial property for which there's a lot of demand, like healthcare facilities, or into residential properties like apartments and condos. This is essentially the playbook that New York City has used in the past when demand for office buildings has faltered. They did it in the late 80s and early 90s, and according to one estimate, over 40% of the residential units built in Lower Manhattan over the past 3 decades were converted from old office buildings. That said, this isn't something that's easy to do. Zoning restrictions, high costs, and floor plans that aren't conducive to residential use make converting some office buildings difficult, if not impossible. So we'll see what happens. There's no sugarcoating it. The next few years are going to be challenging, especially for owners of low-quality office buildings, the businesses that surround them, the banks that lend to them, and local governments. But this doesn't necessarily have to become an economy-wide crisis. After all, this isn't a shock that's going to come as a surprise. We know this is going to happen, so there's time for the affected parties to prepare. That time and foresight reduces any negative fallout on the broader economy. Another thing I'll note is that there's some parallels between what we're seeing with office buildings and what we have seen in another part of the commercial real estate market, retail. Over the past decade and a half, many brick-and-mortar retailers have struggled due to competition from e-commerce. Even today, we're seeing the effects of that with the recent bankruptcy of Bed Bath & Beyond, Party City, and others. But despite those struggles, there's still demand for brick-and-mortar retail properties. The same will probably be true of office buildings. We might not need as much office space in the future, and some of the older buildings might need to be renovated or converted to soak up some of the excess inventory, but eventually a new equilibrium will be reached. So hopefully now you have a better sense of the commercial real estate crisis. It's something to keep an eye on, but there's no need to panic about it, at least right now. Hope that helps, and follow for more insights on the economy and investing.